In 1952, if you were a surgeon, a circuit judge, or a colonel freshly retired from the British Army, what car did you pull out of the garage on a Sunday morning? Not a Rolls-Royce. That was for men who needed to be seen, not a Jaguar. That was for men who needed to go fast. Something quieter, something that said, I have arrived, and I have nothing left to prove. That car was the Rover P4. And here's what makes this story worth telling. The men who chose this car were among the most respected in Britain. Doctors, solicitors, senior civil servants, military officers, serious people making serious choices, and they chose this car deliberately, year after year, for over a decade. So why does almost nobody talk about it today? That question sits at the center of everything you're about to hear, because the story of the Rover P4, and specifically the Rover 95, introduced in 1962, isn't just the story of a car. It's the story of a certain kind of Britain, a Britain that valued precision over flash, substance over spectacle, and craft over marketing. And what happened to that car tells you something uncomfortable about what happened to that Britain. Take yourself back to 1878. Coventry. A man named John Kemp Starley set up a small workshop, not making cars, nobody was yet, making bicycles, and not making them to be cheap, making them to be right. The Rover safety bicycle, launched in 1885, changed the cycling world. The diamond frame design it introduced is still used on virtually every bicycle on Earth today. This was not a company that stumbled into quality. Quality was its founding language. When Rover moved into automobiles in the early 1900s, that ethos went with it. Rovers were never built to excite you. They were built to work, precisely, reliably, for as long as you needed them to. That reputation wasn't an accident. It was chosen, defended, earned over generations. By 1949, when the P4 series was first unveiled to a Britain still rationing food and still counting its dead, Rover had spent 70 years building something money alone cannot manufacture: trust. But here's where it gets interesting. The car that would become Britain's defining choice for the professional class was partly inspired by something built in Indiana. And that detail, quietly uncomfortable, tells you everything about the thinking behind this machine. In 1947, a car rolled out of South Bend that stopped people in the street. The Studebaker, low, wide, modern, looked like the future. Rover's engineers looked at it carefully, not to copy it, but to understand something in its language of proportion that could be translated, filtered, brought into line with everything Rover stood for. The result was the P4, American influence in its confident mass and clean lines, but spend 30 seconds with it and you understood this was Coventry speaking, not Detroit. There was one problem, and it nearly derailed everything before it began. The first P4 had a single central headlight, one eye mounted in the grille, staring at you from the front of the car like something from a science fiction serial. The motoring press called it the Cyclops eye. And British buyers, conservative, measured, quietly unsettled, were not sure what to make of it. It was bold, possibly too bold for a car meant to project quiet authority. Rover listened. By 1952, the Cyclops eye was gone. Two conventional headlights replaced it, and in that moment, in that quiet act of correction, Rover revealed something more important than any design choice. It proved it understood its customer better than almost any other British manufacturer of the era. These buyers didn't want drama. They didn't want a conversation piece sitting in the driveway. They wanted a car that communicated exactly one thing the moment it appeared: the person who drives this has their life in order. Step inside a P4 of the early 1950s, and the message continued without interruption. Real leather, the kind that softens and shapes itself to you over years, rather than cracking and peeling within months. A walnut dashboard, instruments that were legible, logical, placed exactly where your eye naturally fell. No gimmicks, no theatre, everything exactly where it should be, because everything had been thought about properly. The ride was what engineers of that era called wafting, not exciting, not sporty, deeply, almost unreasonably composed. The kind of ride that turned a 200-mile journey into something approaching pleasure rather than something to be endured. And the engine, the inline six-cylinder, refined progressively through the 1950s, was never about raw performance. It was about what the British professional class actually needed, the ability to cruise at motorway speed quietly, without strain, for as long as the journey required. Because these men had places to be, courtrooms, operating theatres, boardrooms. They didn't need to arrive breathless, they needed to arrive ready. That distinction between a car built to thrill and a car built to serve is something the modern market has almost entirely lost. But in 1952, Rover understood it with absolute clarity, and they refined it year after year, iteration after iteration, without fanfare. Improvement as a private discipline, not a marketing event. By 1962, that philosophy reached its final expression in the P4 line, the 95 and the 110. The 95 used a 2,625 cubic centimeter inline six, producing approximately 102 brake horsepower. Front disc brakes as standard. Suspension progressively refined across 15 years of production. This was not a car frozen in time. It was a car being quietly, methodically brought closer to perfect. And the buyers knew. Because that kind of man always knows. A barrister doesn't take someone else's word for the evidence. A surgeon doesn't outsource his diagnosis. They drove the 95 and reached their own verdict. Still the best tool for the job. But while Rover was perfecting its formula, while its buyers were quietly renewing their loyalty, the world outside was changing at a speed that nobody inside Solihull had fully prepared for. And the change wasn't coming from Germany. Not yet. It was coming from inside Britain itself. From a car the size of a small room and another that made grown men stop breathing. 1959. Britain was waking up to something it hadn't felt in a very long time. The war was 14 years behind them. Rationing had ended. A generation raised in austerity was now earning money, and spending it in ways their parents would never have imagined. Coffee bars, rock and roll. The word teenager, barely used before the war, was suddenly everywhere. And on the roads, everything was shifting. In August of 1959, the British Motor Corporation launched the Mini, 10 feet long, cheeky, irreverent, cheap to run. It didn't look like anything that had come before it, and it wasn't trying to. It was a car that announced, without apology, the old rules don't apply anymore. 2 years later, in March of 1961, Jaguar unveiled the E-Type at the Geneva Motor Show. Enzo Ferrari reportedly called it the most beautiful car ever made. The press went delirious. Britain was falling in love with a new idea of itself. Fast, young, glamorous, modern. And then there was Rover, steady, measured, entirely unbothered. That contrast tells you something important, because Rover wasn't being stubborn. It wasn't failing to notice what was happening around it. It was making a deliberate choice to keep faith with a buyer that the rest of the industry was beginning to take for granted. The professional man in his 40s or 50s in 1962 had no interest in the Mini. He had no use for the E-Type. What he needed was precisely what the Rover 95 offered: refinement, reliability, dignity, and the confidence to cover long distances without drama. Rover understood that this man existed, that he mattered, that his loyalty, once earned, was worth more than 1,000 impulse purchases. And they were right, for a while. But here is where the story darkens. Because the very loyalty that made the P4 buyer so valuable also made him almost invisible to the people who would soon be making decisions about Rover's future. He didn't write to the newspapers, he didn't attend motor shows, he didn't make noise. He simply bought the car, drove it with satisfaction, and came back when it was time for the next one. Quiet customers are easy to overlook. And, in the mid-1960s, as the British government looked at its struggling motor industry and reached for the one tool it trusted most, consolidation, the Rover customer was not in the room when the decisions were made. The last Rover P4 rolled off the production line in Solihull in 1964. No ceremony, no commemorative edition, it simply stopped. The line moved forward to the P5, larger, more formal, aimed at cabinet ministers and senior judges. The P4 had done its job. But the company that built it was about to face something it had never been designed to survive. Not competition from outside Britain, something far more destructive than that, something built from the inside with the best of intentions, and consequences that are still being felt today. In 1968, the British Leyland Motor Corporation was formed. On paper it looked like strength. Rover, Triumph, Austin, Morris, Jaguar, Land Rover, all brought together under one roof. Nearly 50% of British car production under a single organisation, a giant capable of competing with Ford, with General Motors, with Volkswagen. In practice, it was the beginning of the end for everything the Rover P4 had represented. Not immediately, not in one dramatic collapse, but slowly. Through the grinding logic of committee management, budget conflicts, badge engineering, and the institutional confusion that happens when you force proud, distinct companies to share resources they were never designed to share. Rover had spent 90 years building a specific identity, a specific promise to a specific buyer. That identity required investment, it required patience, it required the freedom to say no to shortcuts. British Leyland offered none of those things. Within a few years, the engineers and managers who had defined Rover's character were fighting internal battles inside a bureaucracy that didn't fully understand what they were protecting, or why it mattered. The quiet, methodical culture of improvement that had produced the P4 began to erode. Resources went elsewhere. Priorities shifted upward, downward, sideways, everywhere except where they needed to go. The buyers noticed. They always notice. And at exactly this moment, as British Leyland was consuming the identity of every company it absorbed, the alternative arrived, quietly, from across the channel. BMW had spent the 1960s rebuilding from near bankruptcy. By the early 1970s, it had found its voice. Precise engineering, conservative but modern styling, and a buyer profile it understood with almost surgical clarity. The professional, the self-made, the person who wanted quality without ostentation. Sound familiar? Mercedes-Benz was doing the same, with even greater emphasis on longevity and refinement. A Mercedes was built to last, the company said, to be trusted completely, to be handed down. These were not new ideas, these were Rover ideas, expressed in German, marketed with German efficiency, backed by an industrial infrastructure that British Leyland was quietly dismantling. The Rover customer, the surgeon, the solicitor, the colonel, didn't abandon British cars out of disloyalty. He applied the same rigorous judgment he applied to everything else in his life. And he reached a conclusion. The Germans were now building what Rover used to build, and they were building it better. That transition, quiet, devastating, almost invisible in the moment, is one of the great, unreported industrial stories of 20th century Britain. Britain built the template, Germany inherited the customers, and almost nobody said it plainly at the time. Before we reach the final part of this story, where those cars are today and what they still have to say to us, I want to speak to you directly for a moment. If you've watched this far, you're someone who cares about the real story, not the headline version, the actual history, the craft, the decisions, the consequences. That's exactly what this channel is built for every single week. So if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, hit the button, because these are the stories that shaped the world men our age actually lived through, and they deserve to be told properly. Leave a comment below and tell me, did you ever ride in a Rover P4? Know someone who drove one? I read every one. And if this video is giving you something worth sharing, send it to a friend who'd appreciate it. Now, back to the story, because what happened next, to those cars and to the people who refuse to forget them, is where this ends, and it's not where you'd expect. The factory stopped in 1964. The company moved on. The marketing department found new things to sell, but the cars kept going. Through the 1970s, while British Leyland lurched from crisis to crisis, while industrial disputes shut production lines and government bailouts kept the whole structure artificially breathing, the P4s built in Solihull were still on the road, still being serviced, still being driven by men who had bought them in the 1950s and saw absolutely no reason to change. This is not sentiment, this is engineering fact. The P4 was built with a specific assumption, baked in from the start, that the owner would keep it. Not for 2 years until the finance deal expired, not until the next model year made it look dated. Indefinitely. The body construction was robust. The mechanical components were designed for serviceability. A competent mechanic with the right manual could keep a P4 running almost indefinitely because Rover had built it that way on purpose. That philosophy, build it so well that the owner never needs to leave, was the same philosophy that had guided the company since John Kemp Starley was making bicycles in 1878. Decades later, on the roads of a Britain that had largely forgotten Rover existed, the cars were still delivering on that promise. By the 1980s, the P4 had crossed a threshold. It was no longer simply an older car, it had become a classic. Enthusiast clubs formed. The Rover P4 Drivers Guild brought together a serious community of people who understood that what they were preserving was not just machinery, it was a record of a particular moment in British history. A moment when a manufacturer looked at its customer, understood him completely, and built something genuinely worthy of that understanding. Restoration projects followed, cars pulled from barns, from the backs of garages, from decades of quiet neglect. And what the restorers found consistently surprised even the optimists. The bones were good. Underneath whatever time had done to the surface, the fundamental structure held. The engineering decisions made in Solihull in the 1950s were still sound 30 years later. That is not luck. That is intention. Through the 1990s and into the 2000s, values for well-maintained P4s began to move, quietly at first, as classic car appreciation always works, and then with more momentum. A generation that had grown up seeing these cars on British roads was now old enough and solvent enough to pursue them seriously. Today, a genuinely good Rover P4, properly restored with solid provenance, commands real respect in the classic market. Not the headline prices of an E-Type or an Aston Martin. The P4 was never about spectacle, and even its market reflects that consistency. But the trajectory is clear. The appreciation is real. The story is being rediscovered. And the people finding these cars now, restoring them, driving them, seeking them out, Recognize something in the P4 that feels almost entirely absent from the modern market. A seriousness of purpose, a refusal to shout, a confidence so deep it requires no validation from anyone outside the car itself. In a world where every manufacturer competes for your attention with screens and subscription features and assistant systems that talk back at you, the Rover P4 sits in its walnut and leather dignity and says, "I was built for someone who didn't need any of that." Decades after the last one left Solihull, that message still lands, but the question we started with is still waiting for its full answer. Why was it forgotten? That's where we started. And after everything you've just heard, the engineering, the buyers, the era, the collapse of British Leyland, the rise of the German alternative, you might think the answer is simple. The company fell apart, the market moved on. These things happen. But that's not the real answer. The Rover P4 wasn't forgotten because it failed. It was forgotten because the culture that produced it was quietly, systematically dismantled. Not by enemies, not by foreign competition, by decisions made at home, in boardrooms, in government offices, by people who looked at something that worked, something that represented a genuine, hard-won standard of excellence, and decided that scale mattered more than identity. British Leyland didn't just absorb Rover, it absorbed the logic of Rover, the idea that you build for a specific person with a specific set of values to a specific uncompromising standard, and that this specificity is your greatest asset, not an obstacle to growth. That logic was replaced with the logic of volume, of the lowest common denominator dressed in different badges, and the buyers walked quietly, without drama, because that's what that kind of buyer does. He doesn't make a scene, he simply makes a different choice, and then another, until one day you look up and realize the customer you built your entire reputation on has spent the last 15 years buying German cars. And he isn't coming back. That is the real story of the Rover P4. And there is a lesson in it that goes well beyond cars. If you are a man of a certain age, if you built something, managed something, served something that had real standards and real integrity, you will recognize this story from other places in your life. The moment the institution that stood for something real was restructured into something manageable, the moment quality became a cost center instead of a reason for being. It happens to companies, it happens to professions, it happened to Rover. But here is the other side of it, the part that matters most. The cars survived, the ones built with that intention, that seriousness, that refusal to cut the corners that would have been easy to cut. Those cars are still here, still running, still being sought out by people who know what they're looking at. Because real quality has a way of reasserting itself. It takes time. It requires someone willing to look past the noise and pay attention. But it comes back. The Rover P4 was ignored for decades. And then the world remembered. Some things are worth remembering, and some stories are worth telling properly, which is exactly why this channel exists. Every week we go deep into the real history, the craft, the decisions, the consequences, the stories that shaped the world men our age actually lived through. If this video gave you something, subscribe right now. Hit that button. It takes 3 seconds, and it means this kind of content keeps getting made. Leave a comment below and tell me what the Rover P4 means to you. Did you see one as a child? Did someone in your family drive one? Or does it simply remind you of a time when things were built to last? I want to know. I read every single comment. Hit the like button. It tells the world that this kind of story matters. And if you know someone who'd appreciate it, a friend, a brother, someone who still believes that quality is worth talking about, share this video with them today. The Rover P4 deserved better than it got. So did the Briton that built it.